My house was completely destroyed in a devastating fire. At 65, I had nowhere else to go but my son's home, but he turned me away, insisting that his fiancée needed privacy. Desperate and with no other options, I called my first love, a man I hadn't seen in over 40 years. When he opened the door to his mansion, he said only 3 words: "You finally came home." That moment changed my life forever. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and comment below where you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far our stories reach. My name is Grace, and at 65 I believed I had endured every kind of suffering life could throw at me. I was wrong. It all began on a seemingly ordinary Wednesday in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was in the kitchen preparing my afternoon coffee when a strange smell hit me. I went to check, thinking maybe I'd left something on the stove. But when I opened the living room door, I was met with a wall of smoke so dense I could barely see. Flames were devouring the curtains and climbing the walls at a terrifying speed, freezing me in place for crucial seconds. The smoke detector, which should have been blaring, was silent. I later learned the battery had died months ago, a small oversight that would cost me everything. I ran to the kitchen, fumbling for the phone to call the fire department, but the smoke was everywhere. Ick, suffocating, disorienting. I heard glass shatter and realized I didn't have time. The fire consumed the house with a ferocity I'd never imagined. My only thought, survive. I grabbed my purse from the kitchen table and bolted for the back door. The last image I saw before escaping was the portrait of Robert, my late husband, blackening from the heat. Outside, neighbors were already gathering in the street. Mrs. Jenkins, my 78-year-old neighbor, rushed over and held me as we watched helplessly while the fire devoured the home I had lived in for over 40 years. The fire department arrived within 10 minutes, but it was too late. They prevented the flames from spreading, but my house was gone. In just an hour, for decades of memories turned to ash, the kitchen table where David did his homework, the walls marked with my son's growth, the bedroom I shared with Robert for 37 years, it was all gone, wrapped in a blanket someone had handed me. I stood on the sidewalk helpless as firefighters battled the blaze. Later, they explained it was likely a short circuit in an old living room outlet. Simple electrical fault that destroyed my entire life. The flames finally died down, leaving only a charred, smoking structure. The fire chief approached me, soot smeared on his face, eyes full of pity. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. We did everything we could," he began, but I didn't need him to finish. I could see it myself. Total loss. Everything I owned, except for the clothes on my back and the contents of my purse, was gone. The neighbors who still had homes took me in that first night. Sweet Mrs. Jenkins offered her apartment, though it was already crowded with visiting grandchildren. The American Red Cross had emergency shelters, but the thought of sleeping in a gymnasium filled with strangers made me feel even more alone. I knew then I had to call David. My son lived about 40 minutes away in Valentine, a posh Charlotte suburb with tree-lined streets and magazine-perfect homes. He'd moved there for years prior after being promoted to regional manager at his insurance company. We weren't close, not the way mother and son should be, but he was all the family I had left. I used Mrs. Jenkins's phone since mine had melted in the fire. "David, darling." "It's Mom," I said, my voice weaker than I intended. "Mom, what's going on? You sound upset." "There was a fire, son. The house is gone. Everything's gone." A pause stretched out, heavy and endless. "Were you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. Just a few scrapes and a scratchy throat from the smoke. But I need a place to stay while I figure things out. Just temporarily." Another pause. "Sure, Mom. Come on over. We'll work it out." Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. My son would take care of me. Despite all the distance, the missed calls, the awkward holiday dinners, we still had blood. He was still my boy. The next morning, I stood staring at the blackened ruins, waiting for the insurance adjuster. He arrived promptly at 9 a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, clipboard and camera in hand. Surveying what remained, "Total loss," he said matter-of-factly, as though those words didn't represent my entire life. "How much?" I asked, dreading the answer. "You had a policy of about $200,000 on the structure, but with your deductible and depreciation, we're talking maybe $90,000, maybe less. $90,000. To rebuild 42 years of life, impossible." Mrs. Jenkins helped me gather some basic clothes and toiletries with the Red Cross emergency funds. Everything I now owned fit into a single borrowed suitcase. That was it. The sum total of the life I had built, the drive to David's house felt like crossing into a foreign land. Everything looked different when there was nowhere to return to. The gas station where I always bought lottery tickets, the diner where Robert and I had Sunday breakfast, they all belonged to someone else now. David's neighborhood remained immaculate. Perfect lawns, perfect sidewalks, perfect lives continuing without pause. I felt like an intruder, dragging my tragedy into their spotless world. His house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red door, chosen by Victoria, his fiancée. I'd met her exactly 3 times in 2 years. She was 30, he was 39. She worked at a downtown marketing firm and had an opinion on everything from wall colors to wine pairings at dinner. I pulled the cab into the driveway and paused. Gathering courage, this is temporary, I told myself. Just until the insurance money arrives, just until I can find a small apartment. I never imagined that walking up to my son's front door with my little borrowed suitcase would feel like walking into quicksand. As I raised my hand to knock, that same hollow feeling returned, the one I'd felt when Robert died, though the floor beneath me had vanished. David opened the door before I could knock, as if he had been waiting. For a brief moment, seeing his familiar face, Robert's eyes, my own stubborn chin, I felt a flicker of hope. He was my son. Blood should mean something. Mom, he said, stepping aside. But his voice carried something unfamiliar. Distance, maybe? Or discomfort. Victoria appeared almost instantly, like a shadow poised behind him. She wore white jeans and a silk blouse that likely cost more than I used to spend in a month. Her brown hair was in a messy bun that somehow looked intentional, and her smile, polished, controlled, never quite reached her eyes. Grace, how horrible about your house, she said, her gaze flicking to my ragged suitcase rather than me. David told me what happened. I set the suitcase down on their pristine entryway, suddenly hyper-aware of my appearance. The cheap, simple clothes I now owned seemed absurd against their marble floors. Smoke still clung to my hair despite the shower at Mrs. Jenkins' house. It's just temporary, I said quickly, just until I get back on my feet. David and Victoria exchanged a glance, a silent conversation that excluded anyone else in the room. I had seen Robert and I do the same countless times, but from the outside, it felt like they were shutting me out of a club I didn't even know existed. Let's sit down and talk, David said, guiding me into the living room. Their house was beautiful in that magazine-perfect way. Every detail matched. Nothing was out of place. White furniture that looked like no one had ever actually touched it. Glass coffee tables reflecting sunlight so clean they seemed invisible. It was the kind of home where you were afraid to breathe too loudly. I perched on the edge of the sofa, my new shoes pressed firmly against the flawless hardwood floors. Victoria flinched ever so slightly. So, what's the plan? David asked, settling into an armchair opposite Manat next to me. Not close enough to offer comfort, but across the room as if we were negotiating a contract. Well, the insurance adjuster said it'll take a few weeks to process everything. Maybe a month. I was hoping I could stay here until then. Just until I find a small apartment or something. The silence stretched. 10 seconds too long. I watched Victoria. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. She leaned toward David, hand on his arm, a gesture that looked supportive but screamed possessiveness. Mom, David began. I could hear it in his voice. The words that followed were going to break me. The thing is, Victoria and I have been talking, and we really value our privacy here. We work long hours, and this is our sanctuary, if you know what I mean. I blinked. I wouldn't be in your way. I'd keep to myself. I'll help with cooking, cleaning. I won't be a bother. Victoria leaned forward, voice soft but firm. It's not about being a bother, Grace. It's about space. This house is our first home together. We're still finding our rhythm. I'm his mother, I said, words sharper than intended. Of course you are, she replied smoothly. And that's why we thought you'd be more comfortable somewhere. Else somewhere, you can have your independence while you rebuild. I looked at David, expecting him to object. To remember that I had stayed up with him through fevers, worked double shifts to pay for his college books, held his hand through his divorce 3 years ago, comforted him when his ex-wife left him for her personal trainer instead. He nodded. Victoria's right, Mom. We think you'd be happier with your own space. Happier, the word hit me like a physical blow. My chest tightened as though someone were squeezing my lungs. Happier, David? I lost everything yesterday. Everything. And you think I'd be happier alone in a hotel room than here, with my family? It doesn't have to be a hotel, Victoria said quickly. There are some lovely extended stay places near the mall. Very clean, very safe. They even have little kitchenettes so you can cook for yourself. I stared at her. 2 years in my son's life dictating where I should live after losing my home. And how am I supposed to pay for this lovely extended stay place? The insurance money won't arrive for weeks. David shifted uncomfortably. I could help out. A few $100 to get you started. A few $100, as if I were a distant relative, not the woman who gave him life. David, I whispered. I changed your diapers. I rocked you through colic. I taught you to ride a bike. Helped with your homework? Held you when Lucia Velasco broke your heart in high school. His face twisted. Victoria squeezed his arm harder. No one's questioning your history, she said. We just think everyone would be more comfortable with boundaries. Boundaries. I'd heard that word before from the therapist David saw after his divorce. Everything. Boundaries. That was the word. You're kicking me out, I said flatly. We're not kicking you out, David protested. We're just saying maybe this arrangement wouldn't work for anyone. Whose idea was this? I asked, though I already knew. I could see it in the way Victoria leaned back, satisfied. As if she had won something. We discussed it together, David said. But he wouldn't meet my eyes. I stood slowly, knees cracking. A harsh reminder that I was 65 and utterly alone. I understand. Mom, don't be like that. We're trying to do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I repeated it as though hearing a foreign language. What's best for everyone, David? Is if your mother didn't have to sleep on the street tonight. Victoria's perfectly made-up face twisted into concern. You don't have to sleep on the street. Like I said, there are options. I looked around the flawless living room one last time. At the family photos featuring David and Victoria but none of me. At the expensive furniture no one was allowed to live on. At my son, who had chosen this cold, beautiful woman over his own mother. You're right, I said finally. There are always options. I picked up my small suitcase. Its weight felt heavier now that I knew exactly where I wasn't welcome. David stood, uneasy, but not uneasy enough to change anything. I'll call you in a few days, he said. As soon as you get settled somewhere. Don't bother, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I wouldn't want to invade your sanctuary. Victoria looked slightly ashamed, but not enough to speak. Not enough to say, wait, this is wrong. She's your mother. I walked out of that perfect house, that perfect couple, that perfect world of boundaries, and lingered on the sidewalk before forcing myself to move. Through the front window, I could see them talking probably about how difficult I was being, how much drama I brought into their peaceful lives. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent years after Robert's death telling myself I was strong, independent, didn't need anyone. Now, when I truly needed help, I discovered independence is a luxury reserved for those with options. I walked to a small budget hotel on the corner and spent nearly all I had on a single night. Sitting on the hard bed, staring at peeling walls, I tried to imagine where a 65 woman with almost no money and a single suitcase of cheap clothes could possibly go. That's when I remembered the business card I'd carried for almost 40 years, miraculously saved in my wallet through the fire, yellowed and worn soft from handling, a card I never imagined I'd use. A card from a man I had loved when the world was young and anything seemed possible. Randall Galloway, the man who had promised to come back for me. One day, before life intervened, and the day never came. I spent 3 nights in that cheap hotel before I found the courage to make the call. 3 nights waking with a sore back from the thin mattress, shame thick in my mouth. 3 nights listening to arguments down the hall, the constant drone of traffic outside the poorly insulated window. 3 nights washing my few new clothes in the tiny bathroom, hanging them to dry over the single chair. The business card felt like tissue in my fingers, worn smooth by 4 decades of being carried but never used. Randall Galloway was written in faded blue ink. Beneath it, a phone number with an unfamiliar area code. On the back, my youthful handwriting. Never forget G. I had written those words when I was 25, certain with the absolute certainty of youth that Randall Galloway would be the great love of my life. He had been 26, dark hair falling over his forehead, eyes the color of golden amber. He worked for his father's construction company after college and dreamed of bigger things. That mattered. We dated for 9 months, which at 25 felt like an eternity. He used to take me to the overlook on the hills outside the city, where we'd sit on the hood of his car and talk about our plans. I'm going to start my own business, he'd say. Something with construction or real estate development. Something that would make him rich enough to give me everything I deserved. I'll come back for you, Grace. He promised the night before leaving for a project in Atlanta. I'm going to make something of myself. And then I'll come back and marry you. But promises at 25 have a way of fading when real life intervenes. At first he wrote long, passionate letters filled with dreams, plans, the kind of letters that made your heart soar. I wrote back, telling him about my job at the bank, about how I was waiting just as I'd promised. Then the letters grew shorter, less frequent. When I met Robert 6 months later at a church event, Randall felt like a beautiful dream, too good to be real. Robert was steady, reliable, 32, with a good job at the phone company. He didn't promise the world, but he promised a house, a family, security. When he proposed after 5 months of dating, I said yes. I slipped Randall's business card into the pocket of my wedding dress, a secret talisman I could never bring myself to throw away. Now, 40 years later, sitting in a cheap hotel room, smelling of damp and stale cigarettes, I wondered what had become of that dreamy man with amber eyes. I followed him sporadically over the years, the way you do with first loves. Through mutual friends, I learned he had made good on his promises. He had started a construction firm. He had become a big deal. He never married, too busy building his empire. They said Galloway was always ambitious. The last I heard, maybe 8 years ago, his company had expanded beyond North Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia, and Miami, Florida. Galloway Development. Shopping centers. Office complexes. The young man from a small construction firm had become a man who wore expensive suits and made decisions affecting hundreds of people. What would that man want, with a 65-year-old widow in a budget hotel? With nothing but a single suitcase of Target clothes? The rational part of my brain said it was ridiculous. Pathetic even. You don't call someone after 40 years because your life has fallen apart. You don't track down your young love when you're old, desperate, and have nowhere to go. But rational thought is a luxury when you're counting quarters in your purse, wondering if there's enough for one more night. On the fourth morning, I couldn't take it anymore. My back ached from the hard mattress. Money was running out. The hotel had already warned me they needed the room for a new booking. I sat at the little table, staring at the card, hands trembling beyond the morning chill. What would I say? Hello, Randall. Remember me? I'm homeless. Can you help? The number on the card was probably disconnected, or it would go to a secretary who would politely tell me he was far too important for calls from strangers claiming to have known him in their youth. But what if it wasn't? What if he answered? My heart hammered as I dialed. Each digit felt like a step off a cliff. Ring, ring, Galloway, Development. Randall speaking. His voice was deeper now, molded by time and responsibility, but unmistakably his. After 40 years, I would have recognized it anywhere. I almost hung up, almost ended the call and tried another solution. But there was warmth in his tone, something that cut through the phone and wrapped around me like a blanket. Randall, it's Grace. Grace Thorne. Well, Grace Robert now. But I used to be Thorne. Silence long enough to think the call had dropped, that he had hung up, that he had no idea who I was then. Softly, reverently, like a prayer or a wonder, Grace. I know I shouldn't be calling like this. I rushed, the words tumbling out in my desperation before he could hang up. It's been so long and I probably sound insane, but I just didn't know who else to turn to. Where are you? His voice cut in, sharp with concern. I'm in Charlotte, a place called the Rest Stop Hotel. My house burned down last week. I lost everything, and my son, he doesn't want me to stay with him. I have nowhere to go. The words spilled out faster than I could stop them, each one heavier than the last. Admitting that your own child had turned you away felt like confessing a failure so deep it branded your soul. Give me the exact address, Randall said, his tone shifting to something firm, controlled. I'm coming to get you. You don't have to do that. I don't even know why I called. I guess I just needed to hear a familiar voice. Grace. His tone left no room for argument. Tell me where you are. I'm walking to my car right now. Through the receiver, I heard the muffled sound of a door closing, then an engine turning over. He wasn't just saying it, he was already on his way. This man I hadn't spoken to in 40 years was dropping everything to come find me. I gave him the address. My voice barely above a whisper. Randall, I'm not the girl you remember. Neither am I, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But I've been waiting 40 years for this call. After we hung up, I sat frozen, staring at the phone in disbelief. Then the panic set in. What was I doing? What were we doing? You couldn't just pick up a relationship after 4 decades as if it were a conversation paused mid-sentence. It was insane, irrational, and yet beneath the fear, there was something else. Something I hadn't felt since before the fire. Hope. Maybe foolish hope. Maybe the kind that breaks your heart all over again. But it was still hope, and at 65 with nothing left to lose. Hope was enough. At exactly 10:45, a silver Mercedes pulled up in front of the hotel, gleaming, polished, completely out of place against the cracked sidewalk and flickering neon sign. I peered through the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The tinted glass hid whoever was inside, but something deep in me already knew. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and there he was, even after 40 years gray at the temples. Lines tracing the edges of his eyes, his frame broader. Steadier eye knew him instantly. Randall Galloway stepped out of that car as if he'd just walked out of my memories. He looked up. And when our eyes met through the glass, it was as though time folded in on itself. The decades between us collapsed, leaving only the two people who once sat on the hood of a car and dreamed about the future. I grabbed my small suitcase and hurried down the stairs. Before I could lose my nerve, he was waiting by the car. When I stepped outside, the same quiet confidence, only now tempered by age and success. He wore dark jeans, a navy sweater that looked effortless but expensive, like everything in his world now was, but his eyes, those amber eyes, were unchanged. I wanted to hide. My hair was a mess, my cheap clothes wrinkled, my face drawn from sleepless nights. Standing next to him, I felt small, dull, forgotten. But then he smiled, and for a moment, I was 25 again. I walked toward him slowly, breath caught in my throat. "Hello, Grace," he said softly. Up close, the years showed. His dark hair had turned silver at the edges. Fine lines framed his eyes and mouth. He was broader now, more grounded, as if the weight of everything he'd built had settled into him. But when he smiled, I saw him, the man from the Overlook, the dreamer who promised me the world. "Hello," I managed, my voice breaking on the single word I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. He studied my face for a long moment, those amber eyes taking in every detail. I wanted to apologize for how I looked, how far I'd fallen, for calling him after all those years with nothing to offer but trouble instead. He said 3 words that changed everything. "You look beautiful." I started to cry. Right there on the sidewalk in front of that budget hotel with Randall Galloway standing next to me, I completely fell apart. 40 years of pent-up tears. 4 days of uncertainty and despair. A lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. It all came out in ugly, gasping sobs I couldn't control. He didn't say anything, didn't try to shush me or tell me it would be fine. He simply took my suitcase in one hand and wrapped the other around me as I collapsed against his chest. He smelled of expensive cologne and clean laundry, of success and stability, of everything I had lost and everything I'd never had. His sweater was soft against my cheek, his arms strong around my trembling shoulders. "I'm sorry," I choked, my voice muffled against him. "I shouldn't have called. I shouldn't have dragged you into this mess." He murmured, hand stroking my back. "You should have called years ago." When the tears subsided, I pulled back, embarrassed by the damp patch I'd left on his sweater. I must look like a disaster. He reached out, gently wiping a tear from my cheek. "You look like someone who's been through hell and survived it." "That's not a disaster, Grace. That's strength." I laughed, shaky and bitter. "Strength. I'm staying in a dive hotel because my own son doesn't want me. That's not strength. That's pathetic." His jaw tightened, a flash of anger flickering behind his eyes. "Your son is a fool. You don't know him." "I don't need to know him. I know you." He paused, hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "Or at least I know you." Hearing my maiden name from him spoken as if it were something precious he had carried all these years, made my chest ache with longing for the woman I used to be. "That was a long time ago," I said. "I'm not that girl anymore." "Maybe not," he agreed, "but I'd like to meet the woman she became." He lifted my suitcase into the trunk of his luxury car as if it were a treasure, not a cheap bag holding the last remnants of my life. As he opened the passenger door, I paused, stunned. The morning of the fire I had a home, memories, a life built over decades. Now I was stepping into the car of a man I hadn't seen in 40 years, heading into the unknown. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Home," he said simply. The drive took almost an hour, passing increasingly wealthy neighborhoods until we reached an area I'd never seen. Rolling hills dotted with properties hidden behind stone walls and iron gates, trees planted with precision, mailboxes that probably cost more than most cars. Randall turned into a long driveway marked by a small brass plaque. Galloway. The road curved through mature trees and manicured gardens before opening to a circular drive in front of a house that stole my breath. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't ostentatious. It was elegant, confident, built to last. Stone, wood, tall windows that caught the afternoon light. A porch that invited you to sit, linger, breathe. "Randall," I whispered, looking at this monument to everything he had achieved. This is incredible." He parked, but didn't get out. Instead, he sat, taking it in as if seeing it through my eyes. "It's too big," he said quietly. "It always has been. I built it thinking I'd fill it one day." He shrugged, a familiar gesture that made my heart ache. "Some dreams don't work out the way you plan. You never married." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "We start over, Grace," he said softly. "Not from where we left off, but from who we are now." He stood and came around the table, offering his hand like it was a promise. I hesitated only a second before taking it. His palm was warm, steady, grounding. "Come on," he said. "There's something I want to show you." He led me down a hallway filled with framed photographs, people I didn't know, moments from a life that had carried on without me. Yet, somehow, it didn't feel like I was intruding. It felt like the story had just been waiting for me to turn the page at the end of the hall. Randall stopped in front of a door and opened it quietly. Inside was a sunlit room overlooking the garden. The air smelled faintly of cedar and roses. Against the far wall stood an old piano, the same make and color as the one I used to play in my parents' living room. "I bought it 20 years ago," he said. "Every time I saw one like yours, I couldn't walk away." My breath caught. The keys were worn, the bench slightly scuffed, but It was beautiful. You kept this for me. He smiled, that same gentle curve of his mouth that could still undo me. For us, he corrected. Because some things are worth waiting for. I sat down on the bench, running my fingers over the cool ivory. I don't even remember how to play. Then learn again, he said simply. We have time. His words shouldn't have felt as powerful as they did, but they hit me like sunlight after a storm. We have time. I pressed one key, then another. The sound was tentative, fragile, like a memory learning to breathe again. Randall stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. In that moment, surrounded by light and music and the quiet heartbeat of something reborn, I realized I wasn't starting from nothing. I was starting from survival. From love rediscovered after a lifetime apart. And for the first time since the fire, I didn't feel lost. I felt found. Would you like me to continue this into a closing scene? Maybe with a soft emotional twist or a subtle cliffhanger, for example? Something from Randall's past or Grace's son reappearing? Ghost of something that ended before it even began, I whispered. He nodded slowly, the firelight catching the edges of his profile, turning him to bronze. It was never a ghost. Grace, it was a promise I couldn't forget. My heart ached, not the painful kind that comes from loss, but the deep, trembling kind that comes from realizing someone has carried your name in their heart for a lifetime. For a long moment. We just sat there in the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, the rain softened into a mist, tapping gently against the windows like the world itself was holding its breath. I don't know what to say. I finally managed. You should have lived your life, Randall. You should have married her. You should have, he interrupted softly. Grace, I did live my life. I built something lasting. I made mistakes. I learned. But none of it ever filled the quiet the way you did, even in your absence. I stared into the flames, watching them twist and dance. You make it sound like I was worth waiting for. He smiled. Not the polished, practiced smile of a businessman, but the gentle, boyish one that used to undo me when we were young. You were worth every empty room, every quiet dinner, every wrong woman. The tears came again, softer this time, not from pain, but from something that felt dangerously like joy. Randall reached out, brushing one from my cheek. Grace, I didn't bring you here to rewrite the past. I brought you here because I want you in my present. I took his hand. It was warm, strong, familiar. Then, let's start with that. And we did. The days slipped by quietly, full of small, tender moments that stitched together the torn fabric of my life. A shared breakfast, a walk through the orchard, a late-night laugh over a terrible old movie. But peace, I learned, has a way of stirring the ghosts you think you've buried. One afternoon, as I was watering the orchids in the greenhouse, Randall called from the veranda, his voice unusually tense. Grace, there's someone here to see you. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped outside. A silver SUV was parked in the driveway, one I recognized instantly. David, he stood there. Raincoat still damp, his expression a strange mix of guilt and defensiveness. Mom, he said, his voice uncertain. We need to talk. My heart stuttered. Behind me, I felt Randall step closer, steady as ever, but silent, letting me choose what came next. 40 years had brought me back to Randall. Maybe it was time to face the life I'd left behind. Too, I straightened my shoulders, the sound of the rain returning as if on cue, and said softly, then let's talk, David. But this time, you listen first. Would you like me to continue this into the final emotional chapter where the son's visit brings a shocking reveal or redemption twist, for example? Randall knowing more about David than Grace ever realized. The possibility that someday, somehow, I might need him and he would be there hung in the air between us. I looked at Randall, this successful, handsome man who could have had anyone, and tried to process what he was telling me. This is crazy, I said. It is, he admitted, leaning forward and taking my hands in his. But crazier is that you kept my business card in your wallet for 40 years? He was right. We were both a little crazy, haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. Yet somehow, against all odds, that same brand of crazy had brought us back together. 3 weeks after I arrived, my phone rang. David, my stomach clenched. Hello, dear, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Mom, he began, careful, controlled. I've been trying to reach you. Your phone goes straight to voicemail. True, I'd been screening calls, avoiding any guilt or obligations he might try to impose. I've been busy, I said. Busy doing what? I heard you checked out of that hotel weeks ago. Where are you living? I looked around Randall's kitchen, the fresh flowers, the sparkling glasses. I'm staying with a friend, I said, letting the words hang. What friend? Mom, you don't have friends with money. His assumption stung, though it had been true after Robert died. Most of my friendships had faded. I was too proud, too tired to maintain them when I had nothing to offer. Would you be surprised? I asked coldly. There was a pause. Mom, I think we need to talk, he finally said. Victoria and I, maybe we were too hasty. Perhaps you could stay in our guest room for a while, just until you get back on your feet. The offer that might have meant everything a month ago now felt hollow. What had changed? I realized he'd likely heard through the neighborhood gossip that I was no longer staying in a cheap hotel. Curiosity made him generous. That's kind of you, I said, but I'm perfectly happy where I am. Mom, you can't just move in with a stranger. It's not safe. What do you even know about this person? I know he's never made me feel like a burden. I know he values my company, appreciates my cooking, and tells me I'm beautiful every single day. That wasn't the life I had with my first husband. My wedding to Robert 40 years ago had been all about expectation: white dress, church ceremony, community center reception, DJ cash bar, everyone invited because that's what you did. This time, with Randall, it was different. The ceremony was in his backyard on a crisp November morning, 5 months after that fateful call. Simple, intimate, perfect in its quiet elegance. The pastor was an old friend. The only witnesses were Maria, the housekeeper, and Marcus, Randall's business partner and best friend. I wore a simple blue dress. He wore a gray suit. No stress, no expectations. Just two people reunited after 4 decades, promising to spend whatever time they had left together. David came. I'd debated inviting him, but Randall insisted. He's your son, he said softly. You'll regret it if you don't give him a chance to make it, right? So I called him 2 weeks before the wedding. Randall and I are getting married, I said flatly. November 15th at 2 o'clock. You're welcome to come, but Victoria is not invited. David arrived alone, uncomfortable, polite, calculating. He shook Randall's hand, tried to smile as the pastor declared us husband and wife. But I saw through it the way he measured everything, valued the wealth markers, the house, the car. This morning, I woke up in Randall's arms, in our home, surrounded by warmth and sunlight streaming through the windows. I smelled the coffee he made every morning before I even stirred. At 66, I was happier than I had ever been, not because of money, a house, or success, but because someone saw me, truly saw me, and chose to love what he saw. The fire had taken my old life, turned it to ash. But as I watched Randall across the breakfast table, reading his paper, I realized sometimes destruction is just another word for renewal. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you truly needed. And sometimes, if you are very, very lucky, first love gets a second chance to become forever love. That old business card, kept for 40 years, now sits framed on Randall's desk, a reminder some promises are worth keeping, even if it takes decades to deliver them. Did you enjoy this story? I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Let's meet in the comments. If you liked it, consider sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe, and check out the 2 new life stories on the screen. You won't want to miss them. See you in the next story, with love and respect.